Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In today's show, we're going to discuss, firstly, the Trump War Powers Act, or the Iran War Powers Act, I should say more correctly. And there has been now the vote by the U.S. Senate as well, which, as we know, the Senate is controlled by Trump's own party, i.e. the Republicans at this point in time. However, it seems that there is bipartisan concern about Trump's actions vis-a-vis his assassination of Qasem Soleimani, who was an Iranian general, as well as, of course, others who were part of that entourage. This all occurring not too long ago, right close to Baghdad International Airport. Then we had those ensuing tensions playing out as well in the region, with everyone talking about a possible even World War III or otherwise. It seems the U.S. lawmakers have, as I said, agreed across the party lines that this was the U.S. president overstepping the authority that he has under the Iraq or the AUMF War Power Act, essentially. What does this mean then going forward? Will Donald Trump, and he will, of course, veto this bill when it comes to his table at the White House, but nevertheless, will he now reconsider his actions going forward? And what does this mean then for future U.S. presidents as well and their ability to wage war as a whole? Let's discuss this further. We're now joined by Farhang Jahanpour, who is a part-time tutor at the Department of Continuing Education at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. He's joining us now from London. Farhang, as always, we appreciate your time here in Scope. What do you make of the vote? Because this is significant, isn't it? The justification for the assassination of Soleimani was that he posed a direct threat to the U.S. At least that's what came out at the beginning. But it doesn't really seem to be the case, actually, does it?
No, I think, as you said, this is a very significant move, almost unique in the annals of recent history of the Senate, because, as you know, the Senate is also controlled by a number of very strong anti-Iranian hawks. The background to this situation goes back to the 9/11 attacks on New York and Washington, when the Congress passed what is called the War Power Acts. Because, as you know, according to the Constitution, it is the Congress which has the right to declare war or to provide funding for it, especially. That's the most important part, because they can cut off the funding. But the president can only declare war in cases of emergency, if U.S. is under attack or self-defense, which, of course, the situation at 9/11 provided a very good example for. But this gave the president many more powers than they had traditionally enjoyed. But of course, with the recent events, when the United States and Iran practically went to war after many events in the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and especially after the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, I think Congress and American people as a whole got a bit scared that they have to put some limit on President Trump. And as you said, it is significant that quite a number of Republicans passed to the other side, and the vote was passed 55 to 44, which is very significant. Of course, again, as you said, President Trump might veto it, but I think the main importance about this is its moral power, which somehow limits the power of the president.
So, right after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, Donald Trump had said that there was an imminent threat that had been posed by the Iranian general to the U.S. or its interests specifically in the region. Do you believe that Soleimani really did pose a threat to the U.S.?
I mean, the Americans themselves really don't believe it, because President Trump initially said we had intelligence that 4 U.S. embassies were going to come under attack. There was an imminent attack. As you know, there was an attack on a U.S. base, and an Iraqi national who is a U.S. national sort of contractor was killed in that incident. And the Americans immediately blamed so-called Iran-backed militia, Iraqi militia, the Kataib Hezbollah. But even the Secretary of Defense, Esper, said that he had not received any intelligence about the 4 embassies. Later on, it emerged that nothing really had been happening at all, that Soleimani had gone, in fact, to Iraq to convey a message from Iran in response to a Saudi message for rapprochement. And so even President Trump said it doesn't really matter. He was a bad man and so on. So yes, it was certainly an act which they wanted to commit, but there was no real justification for it, although it was an act of war. A major general of the Iranian army and a major general in the Iraqi army, Mehdi al-Mohandes, were assassinated, and the situation became very bad. And of course, Iran retaliated against two bases. And at first, President Trump tweeted, "All is well, nothing has happened, nobody has been injured." Then they said 11 people have been injured. Then they said 15 people and so on. And in fact, yesterday we learned from Pentagon that over 160, at least 106 U.S. forces had received very bad traumatic shock. A number of them have been sent to hospitals. Some have gone to Germany for examination to be sent to America. So it was much more significant than they said at the beginning. But it has been a litany of, if you like, misinformation after misinformation.
All right, so let's go back to you made earlier, Farhang, about what's happened since 9/11, right? And because, as you correctly there said, the AUMF came into force right after 9/11, essentially giving the commander-in-chief of the U.S. the authority to then essentially wage war where he felt or she felt it was completely necessary to defend the homeland. Do you think that U.S. presidents have been too trigger-happy in the ensuing years?
Well, there have been a number of issues which have made the U.S. presidents a little trigger-happy. I think a major change came about after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because before that time, there were two powers, they had some proxy wars, but both of them were very clear and certain and sure not to transgress and not to go beyond certain red lines. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Americans, as we saw, in fact, in the President first Bush, President Robert W. Bush in Kuwait, where he went and, major U.S. involvement. And of course, they didn't listen to Gorbachev, who was trying to mediate. Since then, of course, we have seen many involvements. We have seen the sanctions on Iraq. We have seen various attacks on Iraq. Then, of course, it culminated in 2003 invasion of Iraq. We have seen, of course, invasion of Libya and killing of Gaddafi. So there have been a number of incidents throughout the Middle East where Americans have felt that they are entitled unilaterally to act in what they call their interest. And this is, of course, what has worried Congress and many American people, because if you follow the American opinion polls, a very decisive majority of Americans are against war with Iran. And now it seems that Congress itself, although it has got many hawks, is also against it. So I think it's a very positive, strong move, good for America, good for the Middle East, and of course good for Iran. And I hope that even if he vetoes it, his powers, his wings will be a little clipped.
Right, so let's talk then from the Iran point of view, if we can, just for a moment, Farhang, because the Iranians, as you said, as you know, I should say, have said since the assassination of Soleimani that their goal right now is to see the U.S. presence in the Middle East lessened or just completely ended, really. I mean, I imagine that won't happen at the level that the Iranians speak about publicly, but do you think that the U.S. role in the Middle East is slowly now diminishing?
I think, as somebody who really is a friend of America, I'm not against America. I think their presence can be and was in the past positive and constructive. But in the past few years, and especially since President Trump came to office, they seem to have become rather trigger happy. Because, as you know, they dropped the biggest bomb short of a nuclear bomb on Afghanistan. They have kept their forces in Syria, although they said they will withdraw. He said he wants to keep oil. They have kept their forces in Iraq. So it's not just Iran which is calling for them to go. The Syrian government is saying that the U.S. forces who are uninvited in Syria should withdraw. The Iraqi parliament voted, 172 to nil. Calling on the Americans to withdraw their forces from Iraq, and this has been supported lately again by Muqtada al-Sadr and others. And I think you can find even in the Persian Gulf littoral states that they are beginning to lessen their dependence on America. They are turning partly to Iran. They are sending emissaries to Iran and talking to Iran. Of course, the Pakistani Prime Minister has played a very big role in this, as well as the Iraqi Prime Minister. Yeah. And they are turning a bit towards Russia and even towards China. So I think, yes, America's unilateral position in the world, unipolar position in the world, is gradually being questioned, and we are living more and more moving towards a multipolar world. And I think this is only right that this should happen.
Very well. We'll leave there no word, but we, of course, appreciate your time today, Farhang, speaking to us there from London and for putting that all into context for us. Certainly this vote, especially the vote in the U.S. Senate, certainly, which has now meant that this bill has been passed, bipartisan bill, which is really important to point out, because usually Republicans versus Democrats has been the term of the day, at least when it comes to U.S. politics and when it comes to all such issues. However, it seems that militarism is being stopped to an extent in the U.S., or at least that's what the U.S. lawmakers, even Republicans, want at this point in time, at least, especially in the wake of that assassination of Qasem Soleimani and the tensions that ratcheted up right after that. Will Donald Trump veto it? Seems likely he will veto this bill. He doesn't want his wings clipped. But are U.S. presidents now going to question whether they should be as trigger happy? Do they have the right to wage war upon whomever they so wish, through permission that they've given themselves, by the way, through the U.S. Congress and Senate in previous years, authorization that the rest of the world has not really seen, or justification even that the rest of the world has not always seen or understood. We know that the Iraq war was a complete lie of WMDs that simply did not exist and were never really found in these years. So the U.S. doesn't have a very good track record either. But then on the other hand, the U.S. president would say he needs the authorization to keep the homeland secure. We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the Munich Security Conference, which is currently taking place as we're speaking. That, of course, taking place in the German city of Munich. And a lot can be spoken of. There's the Afghan, temporary ceasefire, which has been brought in place, but for 7 days at least, between the Taliban and U.S. forces at this point in time. Will that lead to an actual peace deal of some sort, which, as you remember, Donald Trump walked away from not too long ago because of Taliban attacks that were continuing in that country. Then there's also a whole host of other issues that we can talk about. We can talk about U.S.-Iran tensions. We can talk about Libya. And there's also then talk about North Korea, even Kashmir, Russia, and China's growing influence, which is being seen as a threat to certain countries around the world. Then there's the bigger issue. As we know, a report had been released right before the Munich Security Conference saying that Westlessness is growing around the world, i.e. that the West's power seems to be diminishing. And a number of a host of issues have been outlined as to why that may be occurring. But we do see NATO in trouble to an extent. Even Macron has spoken about that in the past. So there's a lot ready to get through. And it seems the Munich Security Conference, especially its sideline meetings, will be extremely important and influential at this point in time in geopolitical affairs. Let's talk about all of that a bit further. We're joined now by David Nyheim, who is the chairman of the International Conflict and Security Institute. He's joining us now from Valletta in Malta. Joining us from Bonn in Germany itself is Maqbool Malik, who is the senior editor of Deutsche Welle Urdu. Maqbool and David, thank you both for your time today. Maqbool, let me start with you. What do you think will be accomplished, if anything, at the Munich Security Conference vis-a-vis, the major issues which currently stand out? As I mentioned, Afghanistan seems to be one which is quite important.
Yeah, thank you, Waqar. There are a big number of topics which are being discussed at Munich Security Conference today on Saturday in its second day. But let me please put it a little bit differently than you said. At Munich Security Conference, the conflict parties do not meet with each other to discuss their differences of opinion and come to a consensus. Things are more discussed openly in terms of seminars, group discussions, and consultations. And Afghanistan, of course, is a major topic there. And like you have rightly pointed out, there is almost a deal being finalized, but not yet signed, between the U.S. forces and the Afghan Taliban, that there will be a 7-day agreement, not ceasefire. Okay. It is called reduction in violence. And this is something very important to understand, that when in Doha, the U.S. talks were continuing with the Taliban, then some of the Taliban commanders, they were not at all in a position or willing to agree that there should be any ceasefire with the U.S. forces. but a big sector of opinion in the Taliban, they were for it. So this whole agreement got delayed and it could not materialize until now because there was a difference of opinion within the Taliban, saying if at all they should have the ceasefire or not. And then, like we have ourselves heard from our sources, journalistic sources close to the Taliban leadership who took part in these talks, that the pro-peace Taliban leadership, they were constantly in talks with those commanders who were against any possible deal with the U.S. forces, saying that there will not be any ceasefire, and they just renamed. They just, if I can put it like that, they just rebaptized the child with a different name. And they called it, okay, we will not call it a ceasefire, we will call it a reduction in violence, and that too only for 7 days. And this agreement is almost finalized, and we hope that is also a credit partly which goes to the discussions going on in Munich, because yesterday in Munich, in Bayerische Hof, where this conference is going on, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he also had a meeting with Afghan President Ashraf Ghani.
Yes.
And things are moving positively in a more optimistic way, and the world will get to know that, okay, after all these multiple rounds of talks in Doha between U.S. and the Taliban, they're finally now in only 7 days. It's almost nothing, but at least. Almost nothing is still better than nothing.
Indeed.
So it is going to be a 7-day agreement of reduction in violence, and that's it.
All right, so David, if we may talk for a moment about NATO, right? Because we've had Steinmeier and others already speaking about the tensions within NATO. We've had Macron in the past speak about that and about how useful NATO really still is. Donald Trump has, asked for NATO member countries in the past and still very much stands by that statement that they need to contribute a lot more to the defense budget. Do you think NATO is in a weak position right now, weaker, I should say, in context, going into this conference? Stoltenberg, of course, has denied that. However, that does seem to be the case to an extent.
Well, NATO stands or falls on the unity of its members. And the Europeans, as well as the Americans, are no longer as unified as they were. So I think it is correct to say that NATO is weaker, and that until greater European cohesion and greater transatlantic cohesion is achieved, NATO will remain weak.
So then what does this then mean for global security then? Because a weak NATO, at least in many countries' eyes, means a stronger Russia, for example, right? And that's been spoken about at this conference as well, where Russian influence is growing, even Chinese influence has been spoken about. So do you think that in a sense that sort of alarmist, language and rhetoric will then bring that unity back to the fore? Will they sort of just gather together again in the face of growing Russian influence?
First and foremost, I must say that I don't think NATO has always been very helpful. NATO has been used by its member states to create a number of the issues that we are dealing with today, whether it is in relation to the Middle East, North Africa, and other countries. So I would say that a NATO which is a bit more introspective is a useful thing. The other thing I would say is that, in a sense, the shift of power within Europe is moving eastwards, especially now with Brexit, and that will, of course, have implications for NATO and NATO's agenda, as well as the European Union agenda. The other part I wanted to also talk a bit about is what is not covered in the Munich conference and what is not discussed. And that includes, for example, the role of Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member, is increasingly active across the Mediterranean, and is one of the few, perhaps, UN member states that has taken steps to support the UN-backed government in Tripoli. So more, perhaps, attention to these things that are not covered is also something we should be mindful of.
Indeed. Maqbool, I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts about the state of NATO right now? Even, I believe it is Germany as well, has supported in the past the idea of Europe taking more of an independent role when it comes to its own security, possibly not as competition to NATO. I know that that's been spoken of very clearly by German and other European officials also, but that idea does seem to go along the lines of this divide that is growing within NATO, especially between the United States and its European partners.
That's very right, Waqar. I would fully agree with you, and that also what David just pointed out. The thing is, NATO as a defense bloc which takes its decisions ideally with the unanimity of opinion of all the member states has not been successful in taking decisions and influencing the world events, especially in security and strategic areas, as much as they have been doing in the past. And now the result is, we have had occasions where the world community has seen behind the door and partly also public debates between different leaders of NATO member states where they were arguing about how the alliance should be financed. For example, what Donald Trump has been saying and what Macron said from France and what Germany's Merkel has been saying. And that is why now this is split, like David also said and you mentioned, it is today weaker than the condition in which it was previously. So there is a growing feeling in Europe that it is great to be part of NATO, this transatlantic relationship, but at the same time, Europe's own self-reliance in security issues and in defense matters should not be underplayed or underestimated. And that is why I will just quote a part of the speech from German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas on the first day of this conference yesterday on Friday. And he said that we in European Union must take measures that at least in the next 10 years, Europe has its own defense union. Now look at that. Defense union in Europe could also be seen as a part of an overall process of integration in Europe, like political union, free movement of citizens, workplace freedom. Anybody can go from one member state to the other, live there, work there, and also monetary union. But thinking of European Defense Union, that is a decision which the European leaders are forced to make, not only for their own long-term benefit, but it also is an aftershock of what has been happening within NATO. Donald Trump always asking all others are not paying their enough dues.
Yeah.
They are not allocating enough money and funds for the defense budget, so that if their defense is dependent on NATO, which is of course being led by America with a lot of financial input and military dominance on this alliance,
Indeed.
then US wants that member states, the major ones in Europe, for example, Germany was one of those countries against which Donald Trump has been loudest in his criticism. But on the other hand, we should also not forget a very powerful statement by German President, like you said, Steinmeier, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He said that this topic of the discussion, this whole conference, Westlessness, this is also, in a way, a description of the situation in which the world is moving towards more dangerous and destructive security dynamics.
Indeed, and if you allow me, Maqbool, I'm going to cut you just because I want to, in fact, talk about Westlessness a bit further with David as well, and I'll come back to you for your thoughts right after as well. David, on this point of Westlessness, because that was a really interesting report, I felt, right in the lead up to this conference, right, where the report says that even Western countries are becoming less Western, i.e. they're not living by the values that they've espoused in the past, and one can, possibly point to populist leaders, etc. Do you think the entire philosophy of governance in many of those respective countries that we can possibly name as having now populist leaders, is all of that changing? And then what does that then mean for the global order, as Maqbool there was alluding to?
Yeah, I think of course, the world is changing, and our attitude to governance and to values is also changing. As I've mentioned in previous conversations with you, this is an era where human rights and the rule of international law has been rolled back significantly, where we have forgotten why we fought for them during the Second World War and after the Second World War. And that is a reality we're now dealing with and facing the consequences of.
Yeah, so what do you think the consequences will be? Because if I look at just, I'm going to pick on Germany for a moment, because we just had recently this, I don't know if I should use the word scare, but I mean there was the AfD supported, I believe it was a state governor to come to power, and that there was a huge ruckus about that, and somebody had to resign, I believe, from the party, the CDU party, the leader, I believe she resigned because of that reason. All of this populist rise throughout these countries, does that then mean we're going to see divisions within all of these countries because everyone's just going to be more nationalistic, just looking for their own country's interests, sort of like Donald Trump's America First ideology?
I think we are seeing a reaction to globalization and a reaction to drives to integrate and to create reduce boundaries between nation states, and it is in a sense a natural human reaction to respond in the way that we're seeing in many countries. I also see and believe that we're seeing a fragmentation within Europe and less of a sense of leadership globally, and that mix is basically going to push forward local agendas and make them more important, and perhaps lead to a more inward-looking approach within Europe as it has within the United States.
All right, so Maqbool, I'll add a word before I let you both go. What are your thoughts, Maqbool, about just within Germany and the possible rise of AfD, or I mean, I'm saying that in context, of course, the strengthening of AfD now and its influence in the country. And I'm just picking on that because, again, that represents populism, right? And this nationalist fervor. Is that now the reality? Are we now going to have a replacement of the ideology of Merkel and Macron in favor of more nationalistic ideology?
Thank you very much, Waqar. That was the one question I just wanted to give my opinion about when we were talking to David just now.
Yeah.
I myself have been writing many reports about it. The thing is, we have to see it in a different perspective. And let me start this answer with one comment. It was under Obama that Iran nuclear deal was signed. Trump came into power and he said, okay, the U.S. is moving out of it. And this political situation, this uncertainty and unrest that was created, the burden to correct that was left on the shoulders of Europe. Trump moved out, and the European powers, they had this responsibility, then this whole thing doesn't really collapse. And now Iran was looking towards Europe saying that America, it is your ally, so you try to convince them that they shall not move out. The thing is, there are situations where within NATO, within the international community, decisions are taken, one state goes its own way, and that we have seen mostly in recent years. It's been U.S. Under Donald Trump. But it is not all that disappointing and fearful situation in the rest of the world, and especially in European Union. You gave me an example of what happened in Thuringia, in one of those 16 German federal states, politically. There we all need to understand something very clearly, and I would request you to let me explain that a tiny bit deeper. In Thuringia, there was an election of the state chief minister, and the candidate was from a liberal party, which is one of the mainstream political parties in Germany, that is called Free Democratic Party, FDP. And Merkel's party, in that state, these members, they were supposed to vote for this candidate. But what happened was that for the same candidate, then AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, Alternative for Germany, this right-wing, anti-Islam, anti-migrant political party, which has been generally on the rise in many of the German states, its members also voted for the same candidate to elect him chief minister, and that fellow was elected. But the greatest news coming from Erfurt, the Thuringia state capital for the world, is that this new chief minister was forced to resign by the moral political pressure on him within 24 hours. And this, in my opinion, was the very decisive self-correctional this immune system of the German and the European political system. How Merkel, on the same evening, she had said, what is this thing happening? We are not together in policy with AfD. But if we are voting for a political candidate which is not from our own party, and AFD is also voting for the same candidate, that means in electing a chief minister, we both, as two different parties, are in the same boat, and even that is indigestible for us, unacceptable. So Merkel in Berlin, and this whole thing blew up as a short-lived crisis in Germany, coming from Thuringia, going into Berlin, and Merkel, she had said, you must reverse this election immediately. Okay. And of course, in a political parliamentary democratic system, there is nobody who could just, dethrone or throw out any elected candidate. Yeah. So the only way could have been that the state parliament goes through a vote of no confidence against the chief minister, and when he has no confidence, minority candidates, the members, they support this candidate, he would have had to resign. But the situation didn't come up to that.
Right.
He was under so much pressure that he had to resign, and the great thing, this leader, this chief of Merkel's political party, CDU, she was so honest, so straight, so principled. She said that I am ashamed that even my party voted for a candidate in which AFD also voted for the same candidate. So that means that there needs to be a correction, a rethinking at the very basic level, so that there is no misunderstanding that where is the right way to think in politics.
I totally think there, Maqbool, and that's certainly a very important point, important context that you've provided there, and I do appreciate that, of course, the correction that was taken by the CDU and others within Germany on that issue. Let me thank both Maqbool and David for their time and, of course, for their insight when it comes to the Munich Security Conference. We'll continue the discussion about the conference right after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. We're still discussing the Munich Security Conference as it continues, as we're speaking right now as well. They're in Munich, in Germany. Let me bring in two other guests to continue the conversation. We're now joined by Adriel Kasonta, who is a political analyst and foreign affairs analyst. He's joining us now from London. We're also joined by Klaus Jurgens, who is a political analyst as well and a journalist, and he's joining us from Ankara. Klaus and Adriel, thank you both for your time today. Adriel, let me start with you. What do you think stands out when it comes to the Munich Security Conference? There was that report that came out right in the lead up to it about the fact that even the West is becoming less Western, i.e. that it's now not espousing the very values that it always claimed to stand up for, and that there is this rise of populism which further divides really people.
Thank you for answering this very crucial question. I think that the title of the Munich conference, says it all, Westlessness, which means that the world is becoming much more less Western in terms of the influence of the West. Because as we know, gradually the two significant outcomes after the Second World War, which is the decolonization and the globalization, somehow created the opportunities for the countries previously underrepresented or undermined by the colonial era, hence read China, to go to the forefront of the global arena and somehow participate and share the responsibility regarding the global state of affairs, the global governance. And I think that the main topic and the main theme of the Munich conference is the Western insecurity and inability to reconcile with the fact that we are witnessing the emergence of the multipolar world, where the Western powers or European powers are no longer the only player which is dictating the rules of the game in the international arena, but they are somehow interdependent with regards to the other powers in the world. So I think that the power share and the governance share should be somehow recognized by the Western powers and European powers in order to move on and get out of this hubris, I would say.
Klaus, what are your thoughts on that? Because a lot of alarmist language, right, where I believe it was Steinmeier, if I'm not mistaken, the German president, who's spoken about, okay, if NATO is weaker and or the U.S., if there are disagreements with the U.S. on certain issues, and that means that the world is a less safe place. I mean, is it really like that? Does the rise of the likes of Russia really threaten the world? I mean, why is it that just if the West is strong and the West is, in a dominant position worldwide, that means we're all safe, but if it's not the West, then it means we're all insecure? Is it really that simple?
Thank you for having me. Well, I was just listening into the American Mr. Pompeo's statement saying he basically shrugged it off what the German president had to say, that it is destructive politics by the global superpowers. Now, if I may put this into the wider context, what my esteemed colleague just said, yes, the West has to come to terms with it that we have a multipolar world coming up. Perhaps it's not there yet, but definitely coming up. If we put the opening statement by President Steinmeier into the context of what President Macron is about to announce and already basically seconded by the German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, that Europe needs to find its own way. Europe needs to find its own defense strategy. And this is nothing new, but in a post-Brexit Europe, you have to come up with some solutions to avoid another exit and the common European house falling apart. Now, Europe has to come up with two solutions. First of all, to find out where is Europe headed as such, and where is the West headed as such. Is it really that the United States and Europe no longer pull into the same direction? Is it true that they do not understand what my colleague just said, a multipolar world emerging? So many issues at stake in Munich, actually. Many, perhaps even more issues which are really going into the fabric of politics and society than we saw in some of the previous 56 editions.
Yeah. Adriel, you're sitting there, and so I wonder where your thoughts are on Brexit and how that has played out into, perceived weakness within the European bloc. The UK was a vital, very important partner. It still very much is for Europe and for the EU bloc, I should say. Do you think that those sort of divisions within many of these Western countries and within these Western blocs does make us all less secure?
I will answer this question by quoting the famous French philosopher and sociologist Alexis de Tocqueville, who said that history is a gallery of pictures in which there are few originals and many copies. As we know, Britain was never committed to the European cause. We know that General de Gaulle knew that Churchill would side rather with the United States than Europe. So the intellectuals in Europe were, from the very beginning, aware that the United Kingdom is a opportunistic country, as the Lord Palmerston famously said. Great Britain or England doesn't have eternal allies or perpetual enemies. Their internal interests and perpetual interests are, the dictate of the empire. So we have to bear in mind that for the Europeans, it is this chaos on the global arena is posing a threat, but at the same time is posing or giving an opportunity for European countries to reassess their alliances and their stance on the world. Yeah. We shouldn't think in terms that Europe is somehow from cradle to the grave allied with United States. The world is much bigger than United States and transatlantic relations. We also have to bear in mind, from the geopolitical point of view, that United Kingdom and United States are the sea powers, and Europe, Russia and China are continental powers. So in best interest, following the logic of geopolitics, is for European countries, regardless whether they are from the south, east or from the west, to come to certain terms with China and Russia. The United States, as we know, is the prime goal for the United States is to contain or combat China. As we know, the Politico published a very famous article in 2019 titled "For NATO, China is the New Russia." And as we see from the speeches for both parties, both Republicans and Democrats, the containment of China is the prime goal of the United States. And here, the Western countries, and I have in mind France, Germany, and other Western powers, and also other European countries which are somehow involve into that, quad bedroom, they have to reassess realistically what is in their best interest, what is in the best interest of the future generations of Europeans, with which side we want to side. Do we want to push China and somehow have a new...
On that point, Adriel, I'm going to cut to apologize. We're just quickly running out of time, so I want to give you the final word, Klaus. On that issue that Adriel there just mentioned, about this sort of anti-China sentiment and even anti-Russia, I may add on, and there are many antis, of course, we can add on also when it comes to the Western countries and their feelings towards specific powers worldwide. Do you think that that's an unhelpful way to go about trying to solve, I should say, the world's problems? Because I would think it's a lot easier to actually try to work with all of the above in resolving the many issues that we all face around the world. Does it always have to be a my way or the highway type situation?
Absolutely, I can't agree more. I mean, I wanted to quickly go on to China as well. Now, China is on the verge of becoming a technological superpower. Some like it, some loathe it. But having been born in Germany myself, it was the economic miracle which actually fostered democracy over time. Now, very interesting times in China indeed, and I can't agree more with what you just said. It is possible to have a multipolar world, to have Europe, to have China, to have Asia, to have the Americas, to have everyone and anyone in between, start to cooperate, solve the problems together, and not saying the world is not bigger than one entity. I fully agree. I only would hope that conferences like this one, which is labeled the Davos of politics, actually at times come up with solutions. But maybe diplomacy has to be done like this sometimes. You come to a meeting and you talk, but decisions are done in another place. But a multipolar world offers huge advantages and opportunities for our planet's problems. Yes, there is war and civil war and strife and hunger and global and climate change. Now we have a virus problem. It doesn't make sense to say we solve it or you solve it.
Yeah. All right, we'll come to the final word, Klaus, but we do appreciate both yourself and Adriel for your time and, of course, for your insight. So viewers, throughout this segment we've discussed in the context of the Munich Security Conference, the many security issues that the world faces. But, in the lead up to this, as I've mentioned already to a number of my guests throughout this segment, there was that report about Westlessness and even Western countries moving away from their own values that they've espoused. And what does that then mean? Does the West, as our guests mentioned, many of them mentioned, need to accept that we are now in a multipolar world? Or is it not as alarmist as we're all thinking? As Maqbool had said earlier also that, at the end of the day, it seems that Germany corrected itself when it came to the AfD and its influence when it came to one election in that country. Nevertheless, though, if we are completely honest with ourselves, there is the rise of populism, right? I mean, we have Donald Trump in the White House. He's a populist leader. We have Viktor Orban in Hungary. We can probably name a whole bunch of other people, Boris Johnson even really in the UK. So is this helpful to the multipolar order of the world? And why do China and Russia have to be seen as the enemy all the time? Why can't they be seen as partners for peace, to negotiate with and to resolve situations with, instead of trying to work against all the time? Maybe that would be a better way to solving the world's problems instead of always looking at everybody else as the enemy. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.